Morning, everyone, and welcome to Social Venture Partners Dallas. And welcome to our segment in our Response series, The People Respond. Today's session is dedicated to issues that are important to philanthropy, that are important to marginalized communities, important to all of us as citizens, and the people that we care about the most, and the reason why we do this work. Social Venture Partners is an organization of engaged men and women who give their time, talent, and their financial resources to make the greatest impact with social impact organizations. We are very grateful to our sponsors, Knatzer Law Firm, Something Good Consulting, for their continued support of this series. Unfortunately, we are having a little difficulty this morning with some of our panelists. One is traveling. Justin Moore was supposed to be with us and is in Chicago, and unfortunately is feeling very poorly and is trying to, at the moment, secure a COVID test. So we certainly hope that that is not the case, and we wish him every best wish for a speedy recovery. We do have with us Mimi Marziani, who is here today and joining us from Austin. She is the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project. We have our own Miguel Solis, who is a Dallas ISD trustee, with us today. And we are waiting for one other panelist who's having some technical difficulties. And when she joins, Nan Aaron, she's the president of the Alliance for Justice. We'll just bring her right in. So Mimi, we're going to get started. There's a lot of drama in the backdrop of today's session. There are Supreme Court justice hearings going on. It's the first day of early voting. There was a early morning or late night appellate court decision about Texas voting rights issues. Give a little bit of the landscape of how you see things out there and what the most recent ruling means for Texas voters.
Of course. First, thank you, Tony, and to your colleagues at SVP Dallas. Thank you to my other panelists. Hi, Nan, I see you joining, and Miguel. It's always a pleasure to be in these types of conversations. And as you noted, it's probably more important than ever that we take some time to really think about our democracy and our values as Americans. So a lot going on. I'm going to let Nan talk a little bit more about what's happening in Washington, D.C., where she's zooming in from. I am coming in from Austin, Texas. As some of you know, I am the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project. We are a community lawyering organization, Texas Lawyers for the People of Texas, and we fight to make sure that our democracy is free and fair, to try to reform our racially unjust criminal legal system, and to fight for immigrant families. So we have been very busy in recent years. So let me tell you a little bit about what we are seeing this morning and overnight in this first day of early voting in Texas. So in the middle of the night last night, I have two little kids, so it was definitely past my bedtime. The Fifth Circuit released a decision that folks had been waiting for, agreeing with Governor Abbott that he had the power to pull away from counties the ability to have additional drop-off locations for mail-in ballot. I know that sounds really wonky, so let me try to untangle that a little bit. The context is that in this moment of an unprecedented global pandemic, it's changed every way, almost everything we do in our lives, Exhibit A being our Zoom panel here today, and then of course the ways that we vote. And so in almost every single other state leadership has taken steps to make sure that the most vulnerable among us in particular are able to vote remotely so that we don't have to go into a polling location in person. Not in Texas. In Texas, state leaders have fought tooth and nail against expanding voting by mail, leaving us today as one of the very few states that requires an excuse to vote by mail, and the excuse of not having immunity to COVID is actually not enough. The Texas Supreme Court has told us that instead you have to lack immunity and also have some sort of other underlying condition. So that has set the stage for a variety of other fights. The most recent one culminating in the middle of the night last night. So in the wake of that push and pull between the civil rights community and the state about expanding voting by mail, there have been some local leaders, and really, I mean, I think some of the unsung heroes of this moment are these local election officials and folks like Chris Hollins in Harris County, who have said, let's get really creative right now, and we've already made it more difficult for people to vote by mail. Let's make it easier for people to deliver their ballots. And in Harris County, for instance, popped up 12 locations where people could go in person and drop off vote by mail ballots. The ability to do that was then yanked out from under the counties by the governor just a couple weeks ago when voting by mail had already started. A lawsuit ensued, and unfortunately, we got the decision that we got last night. So that's some of the bad news. But the thing that I hope we really dig into today is the good news that me and our team of lawyers and partners across the state of Texas who are monitoring the election have been doing so since the early morning. There's a lot of good news that we're seeing out there too. And that is, we are watching, unfortunately, state leaders trying to manufacture chaos. They're trying to use confusion to make it more difficult for people to vote and to scare people away from exercising their rights. But the people of Texas, famously gritty, are refusing to do that. And the lines that we're seeing across the state today are just unbelievable. I mean, we had some volunteers talk to voters who had waited overnight in line, like it's a concert or a new device that Apple is putting out, waiting overnight to try to be some of the first voters to make their voice heard. And we're seeing that is happening all over the state this morning. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are voting right now. And I think that just goes to show that, the purpose of voter suppression is to try to tamp down the voice and the will of the people. And, it's a wretched thing to do. It is anti-democratic. It's against our American values, but it doesn't work if the strength of all of us comes together and refuse to allow that to stop us. And that is what we are seeing this morning. And it's extraordinarily exciting.
Thank you, Mimi. We're going to come back to some issues to chat with you about what's happening here in the state of Texas. But I want to turn to Nan. Nan, we introduced you as you were coming on. We're so grateful to you. Are you coming to us from New York or from Washington, D.C.? Where are you today?
I am in the belly of the beast here in Washington, D.C.
Well, when we planned this, I did not realize that we would be in the middle or the second day of hearings on Supreme Court nominee. So it is very timely. I know you are extraordinarily busy in that regard since your life's work is dedicated to that issue. Tell us a little bit about the Alliance for Justice first and what your work is about.
Well, first, Tony, I just want to thank you for your work and the work of SVP. We are so impressed with what you've been able to do in Dallas in supporting and nurturing nonprofits. So we're all very, very grateful to you. Alliance for Justice has two offices in Texas, one in Dallas, run by Natalie Ossenfort, the other in Houston. Senior counsel is Jen Powis. And these offices' work is to help nonprofits be as courageous as they possibly can be, navigating the C3, the C4 rules, the PAC rules, but also know where the lines are drawn so that nonprofits stay free and clear from getting into trouble. And these offices have been in Texas now 4 or 5 years, and we're just so grateful for all the nonprofits we've been able to work with over time. So this is wonderful to be here with all of you this morning, and thanks again for Tony for your work. Well, this is quite a day in Washington, and I would say for the nation. Probably Donald Trump's most consequential decision of his nearly 4 years in office is his nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. As I'm sure our listeners know, the administration is very keen on getting Amy Coney Barrett confirmed just as quickly as they can before the election, in time for a possible challenge to the Supreme Court made by Donald Trump. If he's not satisfied with the election results, he has indicated that he will challenge the voters' decisions in the court, and he'd very much like to have another Trump justice on that court, making the Republican appointees 6 and Democratic appointees 3. A few things about Donald Trump and court appointments, and this one in particular. He's actually told us what he's looking for in a Supreme Court justice, and that is he's looking for someone who will overturn the Affordable Care Act. He has, since that decision was rendered a few years ago, has been very critical of John Roberts' decision upholding the act. And he has promised the American people that if and when he has a justice to choose, he wants to make sure that justice will overturn the act. And not surprisingly, Donald Trump has said he wants a justice who will overturn Roe versus Wade. And when you look at Barrett's record over time, particularly during her years on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, she went up to the Seventh Circuit in 2018. She has been very critical of the Affordable Care Act and has also signed petitions, letters seeking to overturn Roe versus Wade. So Trump got the justice or the judge he wants, and now there are 4 days of hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Leader McConnell, Majority Leader McConnell has promised a vote next week. Lindsey Graham, chair of the committee, has agreed to move these hearings just as soon as he can in as hurried a fashion as possible. So it may be the case, given the math in the Senate, with 4 more Republicans than Democrats, that we will have another justice on the court by Election Day.
Dan, thank you for that. You know, it is hard for the ordinary citizen to really understand the effects that these decisions, when they're so remote and so far away, really have on ordinary citizens when they're in Washington, D.C. But we recognize that the 3 judges that made the decision last night in Texas about voter, where you could drop off mail-in vote, we also recognize that those were appointees by President Trump. And so we are always taught, at least I was taught by the nuns, that justice is blind, right? And that why does this even matter whether a Republican or a Democratic president appoints a judge, and how does that affect Texas and Texas judges? Would you speak to that? And then I'm going to ask Mimi to comment on that in a minute as well.
So, and I should just mention it's a treat to be on this program with Mimi, whose work I so respect in the work of her organization. Tony, I am so glad you asked that question. Republican presidents going back to the 1980s actually have talked about judges and justices, and presidents or candidates typically like to mention justices and justices when they're running for re-election. And why is that? That is because the right-wing base of the Republican Party cares passionately about justices, and this is due to the fact that that base has always opposed the Supreme Court's 1973 decision in Roe versus Wade, and looks every 4 years to what a presidential candidate is saying with respect to the courts and justices. It's not a surprise that when Donald Trump was running in 2016, he almost exclusively talked about judges and justices, and that was a tool used by him and, frankly, the Republican Party to galvanize his base and get them out to vote. And we're seeing that this time as well. His ability to talk about the Supreme Court, he hopes, will send a message to the base of his party that he cares passionately about overturning that landmark decision, and with the eye towards exciting and energizing them to get out to vote. Now, if there is a change of administration, and if Democrats flip the Senate, there will be several openings on the district courts in Texas, as well as the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This is because there are a number of judges on both the district courts and courts of appeal who are eligible to take senior status, and many of them most likely will take senior status, which will create an opening. So we could see on the federal courts in the state some real changes. The same is true with your state Supreme Court and lower courts. Today, as Mimi said, people started voting, and there are some judges on the ballot. You've got 9 Supreme Court justices, all of whom are Republican. 4 are up for re-election, including your Chief Justice, Nathan Hecht. You've got Stacey Williams, who is challenging one of the state Supreme Court justices, Jeffrey Boyd. And if she does prevail, will be the first Black woman in Texas's history to be elected to the state Supreme Court. One other quick point, and that is, it's hard to impress how important state Supreme Court justices are in the state. They decide all matters, divorces, family court matters. They just allowed a decision to stand that overturned Austin's paid sick leave. And all redistricting questions go up to state Supreme Courts, including Texas's. So they're very important. They matter a whole lot to people in the state.
Thank you, Nan. Before I turn it over to Mimi to comment on that question, if you are in the audience and you want to join the conversation and you hear a comment or something that you would like to put on Twitter, just follow the hashtag #ThePeopleRespond. Mimi, talk to us a little bit about the judgeships in Texas.
Yes. First, thank you, Nan, for all of that. I really appreciate, in particular, highlighting the import of the state court system. The Texas Civil Rights Project has been right in the middle of fights in the last 18 months alone around paid sick leave, around the voting rules, especially during the pandemic, and all of that is ultimately being decided by the state Supreme Court. So it absolutely matters. So, Tony, I wanted to go back to your original question first, which is, why who is in the robes really matters, right? If you have this idea of a justice or a judge acting as an umpire, which is kind of a thing that people like to think about. And what I teach election law and policy at UT School of Law, and something I say to my students is that, especially when you get to the Supreme Court, but also in extraordinary moments like 2020, across the federal courts more broadly, there's a lot of questions that pop up in lawsuits that are really easy to decide. And I don't think you see a big gap between how a judge decides when it's a relatively easy question. The issues that we've been highlighting are not easy questions, and almost by definition, once it gets to the US Supreme Court, it is not an easy question. And when it's not an easy question, it is impossible to have any sort of mechanical application of facts to the law. When it's not an easy question, the question really is, what is the law? And that is, there's all sorts of interpretive methods that one uses, but at the end of the day, somebody's lived experience is going to color how they interpret the law. And so that's why it really matters that we have diversity on the federal bench. And I mean that, diversity of party affiliation, diversity of legal experience, diversity of lived experiences, all of this is really, really critical. And I'll give you as Exhibit A to this point, what you're seeing in Texas around the voting rules during the pandemic versus what you're seeing in most of the rest of the country. Most of the rest of the country, you've seen federal courts looking at the extraordinary burdens that the COVID pandemic is putting on our election system and the extraordinary burdens that that's putting on individual voters as we try to exercise our rights. And they're actually coming out differently in cases, even versus how they would have come out a couple years ago, because they're looking at the fact of the pandemic and understanding that that is layering on new burdens to voting that they have to take seriously. We have not seen that, at least of the Fifth Circuit in Texas, that they have not been willing, in my view, to fully take account of the seriousness of the COVID pandemic and the ways in which that is burdening voters, and then also our election administrators, especially the ones that are trying to make sure that voting is fair and accessible. And so, I think that right there, that shows us just how much it does matter who's sitting on the bench. The last point I wanted to make, and this is something that I would love Nan and Miguel's thoughts on too, is, I think that when it comes to the US Supreme Court, which is, of course, an extraordinarily important institution. I mean, there's no question. But as is often said, the Supreme Court is not final because it's right. It's right because it's final. And I think that one of the reasons the US Supreme Court is final so much in the modern era is because we, the people, have allowed our Congress to stop working. And I think that when you see high levels of obstructionism that we've seen, especially in the last decade or so, Congress has been unable to respond. And it's amplifying the power of the Supreme Court. So one issue that's very near and dear to my heart is when the Supreme Court in 2013 struck at the heart of the Voting Rights Act and really pulled away a lot of that act's power by making it so that states like Texas don't have to ask the federal government for permission before changing our rules. And this has been a green light for lots of new suppressive tactics. But, as wrong as I believe that decision was, it left a door open, a really big door open for Congress to fix the Voting Rights Act and come back with more robust federal guarantees of voting. And Congress has been unable to do so. And so just something I will, you're gonna notice a theme from me during this panel, but I would really encourage folks watching this panel to think about that fact, to think about the fact that, we should be angry that our Congress has not been properly functioning and that we should punish at the ballot box people who are supposed to be working for us, but who go to Washington and tell us that they're not gonna do anything at all.
Two other quick points, if I could just interject for a moment. One is, I think we have to remember that judges, federal judges, not state court judges in Texas, but federal judges serve for life. And I'm just thinking, as Mimi's speaking, Clarence Thomas has been on the Supreme Court during 5 different presidencies. So while Donald Trump will be in office 4 years, maybe 8 years, the justices and the judges he's appointed, both to the Supreme Court and to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, Texas seats and district courts, will be making decisions long after he leaves office. The other point, I think it's worth mentioning now, is I said how galvanized the right-wing base of the Republican Party is over judgeships, but I think it's become clear over the recent years that progressives are more galvanized than ever over judgeships. Ruth Bader Ginsburg died a couple Friday nights ago, and in DC, on the steps of the Supreme Court the following night, there was a vigil. And I went and expected maybe a couple hundred people. There were thousands of people. I've never seen so many people on the steps of the Supreme Court. Not only in paying respect and tributes to this amazing justice who allowed so much progress to be made for men and women in this country, but I think they were there out of fear over what the future held, and particularly over whether the administration would be appointing someone in her seat who would begin to undo all the wonderful work that she authored on the court and litigated as a lawyer. So I would say that people on the left, progressives, are as keenly engaged in the judicial selection process as I've ever seen them over the past several decades.
Thank you. Miguel, I want to turn it to you for a couple of comments. Certainly want to rely on you for conversations about what's on the ballot locally for our school students. But in the big picture, the pandemic, there is no doubt, has hit marginalized minority communities much more dramatically than it has dominant culture communities. And these issues around racial equity and what we saw after the murder of George Floyd, that there was this moment, this feeling like something's going to be different now. That with the civil rights issues, there's going to be a tipping point. And then we come up against these issues, decisions that are basically disenfranchising people of their votes and making it more difficult. And you would have thought that with the energy and the support of the people and how important these issues were, that it would be reaching the highest levels of government. Do you think there is hope? Do you think that it is happening? And if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and responding to that first, I have some other questions after that.
Yeah, I think I'll briefly touch on this, but then I want to sort of contextualize it in bigger context, responding to also some of the things that Mimi and Nan both have said. And by the way, I should just say, Tony, I could sit here and listen to Mimi and Nan talk about this stuff all day too. So it's an honor to be a part of this panel. There have been moments of significant change in American history that come as the effects of flashpoints. And this is certainly what we've seen after the, viewed murder of George Floyd, certainly catalyzed a unique movement, one that is very different than any that, I personally have lived through, for the 34 years that I've been on this earth. I think that what you saw almost immediately was an enlightenment for many people who had perhaps recognized sort of generally that there are inequities that are really, really holding back minorities, specifically African Americans, and going a step further, that people's lives are literally at stake when, from government institutions making decisions, in this case, a police officer kneeling on the neck of a man until he died, when we expect government institutions to work for us, to work with us, to protect us. And so you saw such a visceral reaction from so many people, and it was very enlightening and it was inspiring. But I also think the pandemic worked against the movement as well, because for so many people, you didn't want to go out, you didn't want to join in the protest, you were afraid of what that would cause from a health standpoint. And so while I believe there was this initial charge, I'm starting to see some of it wane, and people now focusing on things like this, like the election. Ideally, we'll start to see, people perhaps being elected because of what happened in those months after George Floyd's murder. But I don't know. I mean, when people get elected, oftentimes they will forget very quickly why they got elected. My hope is that it will resonate with them and turn into actual policy changes. But there's one other thing that I want to mention too, because Mimi, both Mimi and Nan brought this up, but Mimi, when you mentioned this idea that, the Supreme Court matters a heck of a lot more because one of our branches isn't working as effectively, that being the legislative branch. When people are going to the polls today, I really want them to think about the health of our democracy in general. And that we are really living at a unique time in American democracy. There is, in my opinion, backsliding in our democracy. It's something that I think some people think, well, it's just not possible that America would ever lose its democracy. I'm not necessarily saying that that's the case. What I am saying is the things that made our democracy great are being attacked in many ways, and are being attacked from many different fronts in ways that they've never been attacked before. Really since the inception of America, there have been certain crises that have manifest during specific periods in time that threatened our democracy in an existential way. These crises have been political polarization, raging conflict over who belongs in the political community and the status of its members, sort of speaking to what you've asked me about, Tony, rising economic inequality, and excessive executive power. And these four threats have been threatening four fundamental tenets of American democracy: free and fair elections, the rule of law, the legitimacy of the opposition, and the integrity of rights. And since our inception, these threats have manifest in 5 different periods in American history. In the 1790s, when we saw the emergence of political parties and slavery, in the Civil War, during the Gilded Age, after the Civil War, when we started to see people's rights being stripped away from them almost immediately after gaining these rights, during the Depression, and during Watergate. And at no point in time, though, in each of those moments in American history, did all 4 of these threats exist at the same time. They currently exist at our time, right now. And I'm afraid of what the future of America looks like if we do not figure out a way to go back to these fundamental elements of democracy and strengthen them. But we're talking about this right now when Mimi just said that this morning we saw this upholding of limiting people's right to vote. And this has sort of become something that we just expect. I don't know where our country goes if we don't curtail this. And so I want people to think about that when they go to the ballot box today, because you're not just voting for people, you're voting for the future of our democracy.
Thank you, Miguel. I want to ask you a question. You said that sometimes when people get elected, they forget why they were elected and who they were elected for. You've been elected a couple of times in Dallas. Did you forget who you were elected for, Miguel?
My hope to the answer would be no. For me, I'm very proud of the work that I've been able to do. I've been on the Dallas School Board now for 7 years. This is actually my last month on the school board. Just a brief example of some of the things that I originally ran on, the idea of expanding pre-K so that more kids had access to high quality early learning, making sure that we pay our teachers more. Now teachers in DISD are paying more on average than their peers across the state. Believing in racial equity to the point that we would create a racial equity policy that might help drive the work. Well, we've done that. I helped to co-author that, and also go a step further, like banning the practice of out-of-school suspension for our youngest children because it was disproportionately impacting specifically Black boys. These are the things that I ran on. They hadn't been easy to do, but I'm really proud of the work that we've done. And I would make the argument too that Tip O'Neill was onto something when he said all politics are local. I'd add to that local politics to me are some of the most important politics because they impact our daily lives. And right now, as you go to the ballot box, if you're in Dallas County, you're being asked to vote for some pretty important things, including a $3.7 billion school bond proposition that I'd be happy to explain, Tony, if time permits.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you for your service, Miguel. You know, you have done a stellar job for the students in DISD and for the entire community. And for that, we are grateful for all of your years of service. When you mentioned earlier that you're just 34, I thought, gosh, we elected him when he was 12. Did we do that? He was really that young when we elected him. But we are very grateful for the service that you have provided to the community. And I would like to turn it back to you and talk about some of these bigger items and a bigger vision, and maybe ask you a personal question about, you've been at this work a long time. It has to be at times very hard and very discouraging. How do you keep going? How do you keep up the good fight, if you will?
I was thinking the other day that, oh my goodness, this Amy Coney Barrett nomination, it's a tough fight. And then I thought, well, when are fights ever easy? And I've been fighting Robert Bork and Clarence Thomas and many right of center judges and justices, including several judges who sit on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That your Fifth Circuit used to be one of the grandest, most open-minded circuits in the country. And it will become again, I'm convinced of that. But I think you're in this fight knowing that you're not going to win, but knowing that you've got to continue to push and pull and do whatever you can to help move that ball down the field. I will say that what sustains me is every once in a while you have a very nice win. And I think about those very nice wins in moving forward. In fact, as I'm thinking about it, Tony, there was a judicial nominee in Texas, a nominee who said some disparaging words about young transgender children. And he compared them to Satan's children. And this nominee was being pushed very strongly by John Cornyn. We were very concerned about this judge and his ability to be open-minded and fair-minded. And we teamed up with a group of mothers of transgender kids who then stood outside John Cornyn's door in the Senate until he came out. And when he did come out, some of the mothers got him on their video on their phone saying, do you really believe that my child is a child of Satan? And John Cornyn ran down that hall as fast as he could. And the following day, that nominee withdrew from consideration. So it's really not just what we do here, but it's seeing inspiring people doing courageous things and emulating them, and seeing that group of mothers challenging John Cornyn was enough to keep me going for an awfully long time. So I think that's part of an answer to your question.
It is, and I appreciate it. Going back to what Miguel said about the existential threats, do you have the same sense that there are some very significant existential threats to our democracy at this point in time, Nan?
I do, but I'm also hopeful. And Miguel, I was thinking about what you said, that with the pandemic, people might forget George Floyd and the fight for racial justice. And my sense is that that image will be stuck in our minds and consciousnesses, deeply embedded in our psyches for years and decades to come. And I do think it's a turning point. Just turning on TV and listening to people and why they're voting, for whom they're voting, they do mention racial justice and they do mention George Floyd. I do know in Washington, D.C., despite the pandemic, these protesters are, to me, very hopeful because they're young and they're all races and genders, and it's a very diverse group. And I do think I very much see that positive changes is definitely in our future. I think people understand like never before the importance of democratic values, the necessity of voting, and most importantly, I've been so gratified to see people take to the streets when an injustice occurs, and I think people will do that again and again, and that our country will be much better for it. So I am hopeful, despite some big looming problems.
Tony, could I add to that? Because I also, I mean, I think I am probably rightfully pegged as a bit of an internal optimist, but I also do civil rights work in Texas. So it might be part of what keeps me going. But Nan, I have to tell you, I do share a lot of that optimism. And, you know, Miguel, to your point, I think that some of the things I've seen in the last couple years give me extraordinary hope that people are I know the term woke is thrown out a lot, but people are waking up to injustices that are frankly not new. I mean, Black people, and especially Black men, have been being killed at the hands of police for the entirety of this country's history. And it is really just recently that I think that the majority of Americans are waking up to that fact and understanding how heinous that is. And I think, Miguel, to your really profound point, are recognizing that that marks one of the deepest failures of government that you could have, and it has to be changed. You know, another example I'll give, when I originally came to Texas in 2014 from New York, I came down to serve as in-house counsel for Wendy Davis and her gubernatorial bid, and then stayed on to teach at UT Law School, and then stepped into my position at the Texas Civil Rights Project. And you know, one of the things that I have been really motivated to do in Texas is to really build up a voting rights program at the Texas Civil Rights Project, and really help to bring together a broader movement for voting rights, which I often tell people I spent many years in New York, several of them at a wonderful place called the Brennan Center for Justice, but I had talked about Texas being the epicenter of this next generation's fight for fair and free elections. But when I came down here, I realized that we needed boots on the ground, and we needed to strengthen the connective tissue. Fast forward to last year, there was a really horrible anti-voter bill that was introduced by the Texas legislature, SB 9. It was, we often call it within TCRB a Frankenstein bill, because it had all of these suppressive tactics kind of stitched together. But it was very complicated. I won't name his name, but I personally spent about 45 minutes once on the phone with a Pulitzer-winning reporter at the New York Times, who I believe is a very smart man. But I took that long to explain how the bill worked. It was meant to be confusing so that people wouldn't catch on. But it had some really horrible provisions, amping up criminal penalties for voters who make mistakes, allowing the state to do sting operations of grassroots groups that are trying to get out the vote. A bunch of really other things to make it more difficult to expand polling locations. The list goes on and on. But at TCRP, we started sounding the alarm. And, I think to Nan's point, I mean, I've been, I have not been doing this work as long as Nan. I'm very thankful for all the work that she has done for all of us. I was, for instance, I don't know, hanging out in 5th grade during Clarence Thomas's nomination. But, I have done this work for well over a decade. And I never imagined the public response we saw to that SB 9 bill, because it wasn't just voting rights lawyers, and it wasn't just, the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and the kind of so-called good government groups. I mean, we had, there was a provision in the bill that would have made it illegal under a lot of circumstances to drive people to the polls. And we had groups of folks who were, themselves persons with disabilities, parents of people with disabilities, who were saying, how dare you try to put red tape in front of my right to vote? And we had people from just all different walks of life across Texas come to the Capitol and look lawmakers in the eye, and it worked. We were able to defeat the bill. I mean, it was marked as a priority by the highest leaders, highest levels of Texas's government. And I do believe it was defeated because there was such a broad, diverse coalition. But that sort of activation, especially around a kind of not sexy election administration bill that was filed at the last hour, that was very hard to understand. I mean, it just took my breath away to see it. And I have to tell you, it fills me with extraordinary hope, because I do think that people are paying attention. And I think they're asking really good questions for the first time about, why should, that we can't let politicians use tactics to insulate their own power, which is what voter suppression is. That we cannot allow the failure of government to, perpetrate the highest level of violence against Black bodies. That we're not going to stand for that anymore. And, I'm really hopeful also that we're not going back on that, and that it is going to make a difference at the ballot box this fall.
One other point I wanted to make is when we opened our office in Dallas, I think it was about 5 years ago, many of the nonprofits, and SVP and Tony was so helpful to us in helping us get known around town. But I think Natalie, our lawyer there, noticed that many nonprofits were reluctant to stick their necks out. They thought there was something inappropriate or maybe unlawful about lobbying. City councils and school boards and state legislatures. And at the same time, we noticed that foundations around the state were also very nervous about giving grants to their nonprofits and allowing them to use their money to do advocacy. And what Natalie reports in Dallas and Jen in Houston is there's been a sea change in the state. Nonprofits are lobbying and getting involved in moving the state legislature forward and forming 501c4s so that they can do even more lobbying and some electoral work. So that the whole sector in the state has really undergone a transformation. And I'm also pleased to see that so many foundations that were so scared to have their grantees speak out on issues are now much more comfortable with their doing so, and have really made it a concerted effort to understand what the Texas state law is and what the IRS laws are, so that they and their grantees can become much more effective, more robust, more aggressive, and also stay out of trouble. So I think Texas is moving forward, particularly the nonprofit and foundation sector, in a very powerful way.
I appreciate that. And of course, one of the things that philanthropy has to own is that our impact has not always been that significant, right? And so impact grows when philanthropy and government and all of the sectors, individuals come together to work on common goals. And so, Miguel, I want to turn it to you for the last few minutes and get your opinion on the bond that's on the ballot and what that means. And do you support that? And talk to us. At SVP, our mission is, we have a couple of significant missions. One is to educate philanthropists on the most impactful things that they need to know in order to increase their impact. And the other is to actually do things that bring about these results. So tell us if this is an action that we should be taking and why.
Oh, I would, I'm a little biased given the fact that I have spent so much time in DISD. But I, from an objective standpoint, look, we're asking the voters to approve the largest bond in the history of the state of Texas, double the amount of the largest school bond in the history of Texas, which would have been Houston ISD's bond back in 2012, which was a $1.8 billion bond. And the reason why we are asking people to do this is because, it's for 5 major reasons. The first reason is that Dallas ISD has been on an upward trajectory when it comes to improving academic performance for our students. And that means, literally being ranked right now as the fastest improved large urban district in the entire state. And while that academic improvement has been really phenomenal and helped us change the educational landscape locally, but also inform things like what would ultimately be school finance reform, which hadn't happened for 20 plus years. A lot of that bill came from stuff that's happening in DISD. The quality of our facilities really has never matched the promise and the quality of our students. And so, number one, we're an improving school system, and we hope, in some ways that we would be rewarded for that work. Second, there is, as we have mentioned multiple times now, there is a compelling need for equity in our city and in our schools. And for this bond in particular, there's a really targeted approach to injecting equity in many different ways. But one specific way is we actually took Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation red line maps that were created in the 30s and the 40s through the New Deal that essentially targeted communities of color and made sure that they did not get home loans, which would allow them to get equity by purchasing a home to then make it to the middle class. Homes is essentially how the middle class came to be in 20th century America. But there are specific communities who didn't get those homes, and because of that, never got the equity and have just seen just a compounding inequity manifest from a lack of that type of equity and resource. And so we are taking $41 million of this bond, and we are finding the communities that have been the hardest hit by this red line map. And we're going to build out facilities on top of the school facilities to try to create opportunity and fill in gaps for these communities. So that's compelling equity is another rationale for why you should support this bond. The next three are focused on the financing of this. So it's very attractive timing for a bond right now. Right now, our municipal tax rates of 2% are at unprecedented lows. And so allowing a bond to be issued today would help generate substantial interest rate savings versus historic levels. And we're not sure how long those interest rates are going to hold. There won't be a tax increase. Let me say that one more time. There will not be a tax increase to you because of how good we have been at stewarding your dollars in Dallas County. And then there is a reasonable tax burden. So Dallas ISD property taxes per student dedicated toward facility costs ranks 24th in North Texas. We're actually one of the least tax burdened districts when you rank us to our peers. And then finally, there's just a ton of investment. We're building out career institutes for kids who want to learn how to be, to get into things like aeronautics. We are creating a state-of-the-art performance art facility for our kids so that they can get more access to things separate and aside from just the 4 R's in education. So those are major reasons why I think it's important that people support this bond and why I will be voting for propositions A through E. Whenever I get to the polls, I would ask people to join me and know that this is going to be at the bottom of your ballot. So you got to go all the way to the bottom to get to these propositions.
Thank you, Miguel. In the last few minutes that we have together, I'd like each of the panelists to just share about how the last several months of American life have changed you, or if they have, how it's changed your thinking in any way. Nan, first of all, I want to thank you for joining us. I know it's an extraordinarily busy time. You have been so generous and gracious by being a guest to SVP on a number of occasions in Dallas. We are very grateful to you for the work that your institution is doing as well. How have you been changed in the last few months?
Oh, oh, it's been so hard. I mean, it's so hard. I still work in my office. I'm the only one here. But when I come down to the office in the morning, I see all these empty storefronts, and it just breaks my heart. I see buses going by empty. And I do think the human toll is just huge, and that is incredibly depressing to me. The frontline workers, I think we're also grateful for, I guess, one, I miss not coming to Texas. I always got such good energy being in Dallas and Houston and driving through the state, so I do miss that. But I do think it has allowed us as a society to see courage up close and see these workers do things that are a great sacrifice to themselves. And I do feel enormous gratitude for them and for the work and the services they're doing.
Thank you. Mimi, I've admired the work of the Texas Civil Rights Project for a number of years. Grateful to you for carving out the time to come and be with us and share your wisdom and your knowledge. How have these last months changed you?
Well, thank you again for having me. And gosh, I feel like it has changed me in so many ways that I probably, will be reflecting on for years to come. One thing I will say, though, is the Texas Civil Rights Project is, very much a Texas institution. We have 42 full-time staff spread around this state. And I think one of the things that has been really profound for me personally is, I am a lawyer, I'm a litigator in my heart. I was joking, a little bit of a community organizer in me, but I also am a manager of these 42 people, and I take that responsibility very, very seriously. And I think that this moment has really forced me personally and our leadership team to think about our internal policies and making sure that they are lining up with the values that we want to see in the world. And, at the end of the day, the Texas Civil Rights Project, like so many businesses, service businesses, we are powered by the heart and the brains of the people who work for us, but it is really hard to be a human being in 2020. And, I'm really, really proud that we have an incredibly racially diverse staff, but it is, I know it is hard to be a human being in 2020. I also recognize that it is very, very hard to be a Black person in 2020. It's very, very hard to be a person of color. And so, I have really challenged myself and challenged the leadership team to think much more creatively and much more proactively about our role as an employer and how we can support the incredible people who work on our team and make sure that they have what they need to do the incredible work that I believe our team does for the state of Texas. So that has been a growth area for me, and something, quite frankly, that I'll note we're still doing right now. We're trying to get really creative to think through what sort of support do we need to give our folks after the election, no matter what happens, teletherapy options, small group discussion circles. Sadly, we're giving folks a stipend for extra security. And again, it's probably not enough, but it's been a profound learning for me.
Thank you. Miguel, how about you?
Yeah, personally, the pandemic has impacted me in a whole host of different ways, my family as well. I lost my aunt, my brother's godmother to COVID. I know you're familiar with this, Tony, and others may be on the call, but my daughter had to have a heart transplant when she was 3 months old. She's now 2.5, but because her immune system is so compromised, my wife and I have had to live an even more quarantined life than your normal quarantine life. But, the glass half full approach to this has been, first, for 7 years of my life, it's been consumed with politics and policy and being out and about. And so forcing us to be together and to spend time together has been, such a blessing. The other thing is, as Mimi was mentioning, it's opened up my eyes as a policymaker to the possibilities of things that we thought may never have existed had it not have been for this existential circumstance. And it's also been eye-opening to the glaring inequities that really exist in our community. We distributed over 4 million meals to kids and families from March to May. We distributed over 30,000 hotspots for kids to be able to get internet. And so now it's got our district rethinking the way that we try to approach issues that for far too long we said were outside of our control, but ultimately we're impacting the daily lives of our kids. So I'm encouraged by what's going to come out of this pandemic. And the thing that I'm the most excited about is the fact that this has shown us the resiliency of the American people yet again. And that when tough things happen to us, we come together to try to figure out a way to come out of it in a better way. And so thanks again for this panel. And Mimi and Nan, you two have quickly become heroes of mine, and I'm looking forward to the continued great work that you do on behalf of so many people in this nation.
Well, you as well to me.
Miguel, I just want to thank you once again for the service that you've given to this community in Dallas. You are a hero to many here, and we are grateful we all owe you a debt of gratitude for that service to the community, as we do to Mimi and to Nan for all the great work that you are doing. Social Venture Partners, in conjunction with the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, has for the last number of years held a social impact conference in Dallas called Big Bang. It will be bringing up and lifting up all of these issues around equity, gender equity, racial equity, economic equity. It is the last week of October. We have over 80 speakers nationwide. Another thing that COVID has allowed us to do is get expert at the Zoom thing. So now we can bring speakers in from all over the country. And we have some extraordinary topics, both nationally, statewide, as well as local folks on our panels for that week of wonderful impact, social impact conferencing. Again, we thank the panel so much. We thank those of you who are in our audience. And of course, it is early voting in Texas. And so we encourage each of you to get out there and vote early. Thank you so much to each of you and to our audience. We appreciate all that you do for us. Take care and have a good day.